What is the price of sunlight? In 696, the British Crown desperately needed warships. The monarch faced a severely depleted national treasury. He funded an unprecedented naval expansion across the global oceans. He enacted a bizarre levy, but targeted a biological necessity. Civilians were suddenly forced to pay the government simply to let morning light indoor. The empire financed its terrifying armada not with gold, but by harvesting the illumination of homes. Every new gunboat required more dark rooms in London streets. Levies investigate the suffocating economics of the window tax. Taxing wealth required a visible metric. The 17th century government lacked a reliable income tracking system. Bureaucrats desperately needed an undeniable proxy for a citizen's prosperity. They found their perfect solution in the architecture of houses. Ephesus could easily count glass palms from the cobbled streets. A family's financial burden was calculated by their simple desire for natural illumination. Glass became an indicator of debt. A poor laborer's cottage might possess merely one small oak. A wealthy merchant's sprawling townhouse boasting dozens of shining paintings. The state weaponized this disparity to fund an endless war. Citizens responded with desperate architectural erasure. Homeowners realized the state was commodifying the sun itself. They took up trowels and bricks to seal their rooms. A massive movement of structural avoidance swept across the nation. Beautiful Georgian facades were transformed into blind, suffocating brick walls. People willingly chose tomb-like darkness over surrendering their meager wages to the Admiralty. The aesthetic of cities radically shifted. Blocked frames appeared on every street in London and Edinburgh. Landlords of crowded tenements ruthlessly sealed openings to garage thieves. Working-class families were plunged into perpetual twilight to say. These bricked-up voids were not stylistic choices, but the physical scars of an aggressive wartime fiscal policy. The daylight robbery was ruthlessly efficient because the glass was impossible to hide from passing inspectors. The window tax became a reliable pillar of military funding. It generated massive revenue for over a century and a half. Every sealed room bought another cabinet for a distant galleon. The projection of supreme global power abroad required the systematic degradation of life at home. Mercantilism demanded a heavy domestic sacrifice. The crown boasted of an empire where the sun remained, yet their own subjects lived in deliberately manufactured pitch-black misery. The fundamental necessity of ventilation was traded for naval timber. By transforming natural light into a taxable luxury, the state ensured its military dominance overshadowed its people. The tax bracket tightened with war. As the continental conflict escalated the demand for fresh capital, the financial threshold for paying the window levy was lowered. Originally targeting only the wealthy, it slowly consumed the poor. But even modest dwellings suddenly faced ruinous bills for their ventilation. Citizens were caught in a trap where basic structural ties became a massive financial liability. Greedy landlords recognized the new laws. Owners of massive tenement buildings faced exorbitant cumulative tax assessments. Their cruel solution was to simply block out the summering. They sealed up stairwells and boarded over the communal passages. The architecture of poverty was literally reshaped by the state's insatiable appetite for maritime warfare funding. The glass industry completely collapsed overnight. A secondary economic shockwave devastated domestic manufacturing across the island, with the population actively destroying their windows to save money. The once thriving glassmakers found their vital order books entirely empty. British technological advancement in glass production stagnated for a century. The government had successfully funded a war fleet while simultaneously suffocating a major domestic industry. The streets became a physical ledger. Tax collectors patrolled the cobblestones with their heavy ink books. They ruthlessly counted pains, penalizing any unsealed source of air. The symmetrical beauty of Georgian architecture, every newly sealed cavity stood as a permanent, undeniable receipt for the staggering cost of military supremacy. Glass became the ultimate status symbol. While the working class suffocated behind cheap brick and mortar, aristocrats flaunted their massive wealth by building heavily glazed mansions. They willingly paid the exorbitant fees to showcase their fortunes. Sunlight was successfully transformed from a universal human right into an exclusive luxury for the elite. The matter of biological debt finally arrived. The unintended consequences of the tax were utterly devastating. The Admiralty ledgers glowed with the profits of darkness. But the true cost was hidden in the hospitals. Without fresh air, the cramped working-class tenements became perfect breeding grounds for disease. Darkness engineered a public health catastrophe. By incentivizing citizens to completely brick up their ventilation, the British government accidentally manufactured a massive biological crisis. Rickets, cholera, and typhus swept rapidly through the slums. The state calculated the cost of a warship, but completely ignored the physiological necessity of oxygen. The economic butterfly effect of levies, a financial policy intended to harvest wealth for war, ended up indiscriminately harvesting the lives of the poor. Medical records drew a terrifying line connecting tax policy to the skyrocketing urban mortality rates of the century. The empire's laborers were rotting away in the shadows of their own homes. Ever then exports the massive economic reckoning. Doctors and sanitary reformers finally exposed the deadly mathematics. The absolute want of light and air was a killer. It destroyed human capital faster than any enemy cannonball. Every sovereign saved by boarding up a window was spent tenfold on the soaring burial costs. The fleet floated on civilian sickness. The Grand Admirals celebrated their victories on the oceans, while the industrial cities choked on stagnant foul air. The horrific mortality rates finally drained the national treasury. The manufactured sickness eventually threatened the fundamental economic stability of the entire nation. Natural light became a human right. The public outcry reached an absolute, undeniable breaking point. The government was forced to repeal the legal tax. They realized a dead workforce cannot sustain global supremacy. A nation's true power is never measured by fleas, but by the health of its citizens. A legacy of bricked brains. The absolute repeal of the dreaded tax changed everything completely. It signaled a monumental pivot in the history of governments. The era of state-sponsored darkness was finally, completely over. The government learned that biological needs cannot be endlessly taxed. Light flooded back into homes, but the architectural scars remained permanently on historical buildings. The true cost of war isn't just gold, but the generational debt of health surrendered at home. We still pay for power invisibly. The modern world demands a constant, heavy sacrifice for dominance. We trade our data privacy for the fragile illusion of security. We accept massive environmental degradation to fuel global logistics networks. Our hidden taxes are buried deep within complex digital ledgers. The mechanics of modern progress are often driven by systems much older than they appear. History shows us that whenever a state claims a necessary sacrifice, we must constantly ask, who sits in darkness? True security is built on transparency. The empire eventually realized the fatal flaw of shadows. A darkened home inevitably leads to a weakened, dying workforce. Those silent cavities in old townhouses serve as warnings. They are permanent receipts for a century of naval ambition. These scars remind us of a desperate time when the sun itself became a wartime casualty. No empire is grand enough or powerful enough to ever justify the absolute theft of the morning light.